Are you absolutely sure you want to do that? The man's voice was calm, almost gentle, but the quiet confidence in it made several people in the bank lobby glance up from their phones. A torn piece of paper drifted slowly through the air, landing on the polished marble floor like a pale leaf. Karen Whitmore didn't look down at it. She was still holding the other half between two perfectly manicured fingers, her expression fixed in the same tight smile she used whenever a situation became inconvenient. Across the counter stood Marcus Bennett, a tall black man in a worn denim jacket and scuffed work boots that had clearly seen years of use. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or argue. He simply watched the fragments of the checks settle on the floor between them. Around them, the late morning hum of Whitmore National Bank continued, but more slowly now, like the room itself had paused to see what would happen next. Karen placed the torn half on the counter with deliberate neatness and folded her hands. "Sir," she said with patient politeness, the kind that sounded more like dismissal than courtesy. "Checks for $10 million do not come from men who walk into a bank dressed like they've been fixing engines all morning." A few quiet chuckles rippled from the waiting line behind Marcus. Someone shifted their weight. Another customer subtly angled a phone toward the counter, pretending to check messages while the camera lens faced forward. Marcus glanced down at the pieces of paper on the floor. The check had been crisp when he first placed it on the counter, the ink still sharp, the numbers unmistakable. $10 million. Enough to change a life. Enough to make people suddenly polite. But now it lay in two uneven halves. He inhaled slowly and lifted his gaze again, his dark eyes steady. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that check was valid." Karen let out a small laugh that carried the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years deciding who belonged inside a place like this and who didn't. "And I'm sure it was," she replied, tapping the counter lightly with one finger, "in whatever fantasy world printed it." The marble lobby gleamed under bright white lights. Large windows framed the busy downtown street outside, where taxis slid past and pedestrians hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases. Inside the bank, however, the air had grown strangely still. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, not hurriedly, not defensively, simply with the same careful patience he had shown since walking through the glass doors 10 minutes earlier. From the pocket, he removed a folded photograph and glanced at it for a moment before slipping it back again. A small girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. The only person in the world who cared whether this check mattered. Karen watched the motion with mild curiosity before straightening her blazer. "Security will be here in a moment," she said calmly. "You're welcome to take your paperwork somewhere else." Marcus nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "I understand," he said. He looked toward the tall glass entrance doors, sunlight stretching across the floor in a long rectangle of gold. Outside, a black sedan had just pulled up to the curb. Marcus returned his attention to the counter and spoke in the same quiet voice. "I just hope," he said, "that tearing up that check was worth the assumption." The torn pieces of the check still rested on the marble floor between Marcus Bennett and the counter as the quiet tension inside Whitmore National Bank slowly thickened. No one in the lobby seemed to be moving very quickly anymore. The clicking of keyboards had slowed. The low murmur of customers speaking with tellers had faded into curious silence. Marcus Bennett stood exactly where he had been standing for the past several minutes, tall, steady, and patient in a way that made some of the onlookers uncomfortable. Karen Whitmore watched him with the same expression she reserved for situations that needed to end quickly and cleanly. In her mind, she had already finished the conversation. Men like him did not walk into banks carrying checks worth $10 million. Men like him did not calmly ask for corporate verification. And men like him certainly did not stand there with that quiet confidence after their check had been torn in half. Karen slid the pen on the counter back into its holder and adjusted the sleeve of her navy blazer. Her office window reflected the bright lobby lights and the large gold letters on the far wall that spelled Whitmore National Bank. Everything about the room represented order, stability, and a certain kind of clientele. The kind that arrived in tailored suits and polished shoes, not worn denim jackets and scuffed boots. Marcus lowered his gaze for a moment and bent slightly, picking up the two halves of the torn check from the floor with careful fingers. The paper was thick and official, printed with the clean watermark of one of the largest financial clearing houses in the country. Even torn, the numbers were unmistakable. $10 million. The ink glinted faintly under the overhead lights. He brushed a small bit of dust from one edge and placed both halves neatly on the counter again, aligning them with quiet precision as though the action itself carried meaning. Karen observed the gesture with mild amusement. "You can take that with you," she said evenly, "because it is not being processed here." Behind Marcus, someone in line whispered softly to a companion, the kind of whisper meant to be heard. Another person shifted their weight and glanced again toward the glass entrance doors. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Cars rolled past the curb. A cyclist glided through the intersection. The black sedan that had stopped moments earlier remained parked along the sidewalk, its tinted windows reflecting the bright midday sun. Marcus rested both hands lightly on the counter. His posture remained relaxed, but there was something grounded about the way he stood there, like a man who had spent years working with his hands and knew exactly how to keep his balance. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this is the fourth bank I have visited today." Karen lifted one eyebrow. "Then perhaps the first three gave you the same answer." Marcus nodded slightly. They did not tear the check. A faint ripple of murmurs passed through the waiting customers. Karen exhaled slowly through her nose, the patience in her expression thinning. She reached for the phone beside her terminal and pressed a button that connected directly to the building's security desk. "Yes," she said crisply. "I need someone at the front counter." Marcus did not move. He did not protest. Instead, he reached once more into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the folded photograph again. This time he held it in his hand a moment longer. The small picture showed a young girl sitting on the hood of an old pickup truck, sunlight in her hair, her sneakers dangling above the front bumper. She could not have been more than 8 years old. Marcus studied the photo with quiet focus before slipping it carefully back into his pocket. Karen watched the motion with detached curiosity, but her attention shifted almost immediately when the glass entrance doors opened with a soft mechanical hum. Cool air drifted into the lobby. Several people turned toward the sound at the same time. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped inside, followed by another man carrying a slim tablet and a leather portfolio. Their polished shoes crossed the marble floor with confident, measured steps that echoed faintly through the lobby. Marcus glanced toward the entrance for only a second before returning his attention to the counter. Karen noticed the newcomers as well, but her focus remained on the situation in front of her. In another few seconds, security would arrive, and the interruption would be handled the way interruptions always were handled here. Quickly, quietly, professionally. What she did not notice was the way the man in the charcoal suit paused just inside the lobby and scanned the room as if searching for someone very specific. The tall man in the charcoal gray suit stood just inside the lobby for a moment, letting the glass doors close softly behind him as the quiet tension in the room continued to settle like dust in sunlight. His presence did not announce itself loudly, yet something about the calm authority in his posture made several employees glance up instinctively from their desks. He was in his late 50s, with silver at the temples and the composed expression of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where decisions mattered. The man beside him, younger and carrying the slim tablet, leaned slightly closer and murmured something under his breath, but the older man had already lifted his gaze toward the front counter. His eyes moved across the lobby slowly, taking in the line of customers, the tellers behind the polished counter, and finally the small cluster of attention forming around Marcus Bennett. Marcus still stood in the same place, both halves of the torn check resting neatly on the counter in front of him. His hands remained relaxed, his shoulders squared, the quiet patience in his stance unchanged. The security officer had not yet arrived. Karen Whitmore remained behind the counter, one hand resting near the phone, her expression composed but firm in the way someone looks when they believe a situation is already resolved. The man in the gray suit began walking forward, his footsteps measured and unhurried across the marble floor. The sound carried clearly in the stillness of the lobby. One of the tellers noticed him first and straightened almost instantly. Another employee nudged a coworker with a subtle motion of the elbow. Within seconds, recognition spread quietly across the room like a ripple across water. The name Whitmore National Bank was not only on the wall. It belonged to the man now crossing the lobby. Daniel Whitmore moved with the calm familiarity of someone entering a building that carried his family name. Yet his attention remained fixed on the front counter. As he approached, Karen finally looked up from the terminal screen and noticed the movement. Her posture shifted immediately, her shoulders straightening, her professional smile returning with careful precision. "Good afternoon, sir," she said politely as he drew closer, though her voice carried a slight edge of surprise. Daniel Whitmore nodded once, acknowledging her greeting without slowing his steps. His gaze moved past her almost immediately, settling instead on Marcus Bennett. For a brief moment neither man spoke. The quiet stretched across the counter, the air between them carrying the faint scent of polished wood and fresh printer ink. Then Daniel Whitmore's expression softened with clear recognition. "Mr. Bennett," he said calmly. The words were simple, yet the tone behind them carried unmistakable respect. Several people in the lobby shifted slightly where they stood. Karen blinked once, her professional smile tightening just slightly as she glanced between the two men. Marcus Bennett lifted his head and met the older man's gaze with the same calm presence he had carried since the moment he walked through the doors. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Marcus replied quietly. The younger assistant standing beside Daniel Whitmore looked down at the counter and noticed the two halves of the torn check lying side by side. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel Whitmore followed the direction of the glance and lowered his eyes to the paper fragments. For the first time since entering the lobby, his expression changed. Not dramatically, not with anger, but with a subtle tightening of thought behind his eyes. He reached forward and carefully picked up one half of the check, holding it between his fingers and examining the printed numbers beneath the bright lobby lights. $10 million. Even torn, the figure was unmistakable. He looked back up at Marcus Bennett with quiet understanding, then turned his gaze toward Karen Whitmore. The lobby had become completely silent now. Every movement seemed slower, every breath more noticeable. Daniel Whitmore placed the torn half of the check gently back on the counter and spoke in a voice that carried easily across the room without rising in volume. "Karen," he said evenly, "would you care to explain why Mr. Bennett's check is in pieces?" Karen Whitmore felt the quiet in the lobby settle around her like a weight she had not expected to carry. Only moments earlier the situation had seemed simple, predictable, already finished in her mind. Now Daniel Whitmore stood only a few feet away, his calm eyes resting on the torn pieces of paper lying on the counter between them. Karen straightened slightly and adjusted the cuff of her blazer again, buying herself a second to think. "Sir," she began carefully, her tone controlled and professional. "This individual presented a check that appeared highly suspicious. $10 million is not a small amount, and our policies require verification when something unusual appears at the counter." Daniel Whitmore listened without interrupting. His hands rested lightly against the polished wood surface as he looked at the torn halves of the check once more. Around the lobby, the employees had become statues behind their desks, and the line of customers stood unusually still, as if the entire room understood that something important was unfolding. Karen continued, feeling the need to justify the decision that had felt so certain only minutes before. The document did not match the profile of the individual presenting it. She explained, her words precise. "And when I asked for additional verification, he insisted the check was valid without providing documentation from our internal system." Marcus Bennett remained silent during the explanation. His eyes moved briefly toward the glass entrance doors where sunlight still stretched across the marble floor, then returned to the counter. Daniel Whitmore finally lifted one of the torn halves again and examined the printed routing number and watermark under the light. The assistant beside him glanced down at the tablet he carried, scrolling quickly with his thumb. A few seconds passed in complete silence except for the faint hum of the air conditioning system above the lobby ceiling. Then Daniel Whitmore spoke again, his voice calm but unmistakably direct. "Karen," he said, "do you recognize the clearing institution printed here?" Karen leaned forward slightly and looked at the paper. The name was visible even through the tear. Her confidence flickered for the first time. "It appears to be North Atlantic Holdings," she said slowly. Daniel Whitmore nodded once. "Correct." He placed the paper back down carefully beside the other half, aligning the edges the same way Marcus had done earlier. "North Atlantic Holdings processes the majority of our institutional investment transfers," he continued evenly. Karen felt a faint tightening in her chest, but kept her expression steady. Even so, sir, the check could have been fabricated. That amount. Daniel Whitmore lifted one hand gently, stopping the explanation without raising his voice. The amount, he said quietly, is exactly $10 million. He turned his attention toward Marcus Bennett again, and the tone in his voice shifted to one of open respect. Mr. Bennett, I apologize for the delay you have experienced today. The words hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. Karen blinked again, this time more noticeably. The assistant beside Daniel Whitmore looked up from the tablet and spoke softly. Sir, the verification just came through. Daniel Whitmore nodded and turned back toward the counter. His gaze moved from the tablet screen to Karen Whitmore with calm clarity. The funds cleared this morning, he said evenly. The words landed in the quiet lobby with a weight that no one could ignore. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he stood, his expression unchanged. The torn pieces of the check rested between them like silent evidence of a decision made too quickly. Daniel Whitmore rested both hands on the counter again and spoke with the same steady composure that had filled the room since he entered. Which means, he said calmly, Mr. Bennett was attempting to deposit legitimate funds into this bank. The words settled into the quiet lobby with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The funds cleared this morning. For several seconds no one moved. The air in Whitmore National Bank felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the room itself had just realized the meaning behind what had happened. Karen Whitmore stood behind the counter with both hands resting lightly on the polished surface, but the calm, confidence that had guided her earlier decisions had faded into something less certain. She looked down at the two halves of the torn check again, seeing them now not as evidence of a suspicious customer, but as a mistake that could not be undone with a simple apology. Marcus Bennett remained still on the other side of the counter. His posture had not changed since Daniel Whitmore entered the lobby. The worn denim jacket, the work boots, the quiet patience in his expression all looked exactly the same, yet the way the room regarded him had shifted entirely. Daniel Whitmore glanced once more at the assistant beside him, who nodded quietly while holding the tablet screen where the confirmation had appeared. The routing numbers matched. The account verification matched. The funds were not only legitimate, they had already cleared through one of the most trusted institutional networks in the country. Daniel Whitmore returned his attention to the counter and spoke again with calm authority. Mr. Bennett attempted to deposit $10 million into this bank, he said slowly, making the statement clear for everyone listening. Those funds are verified, confirmed, and available. Several customers in the waiting line exchanged quick looks with one another. A few moments earlier, some of them had quietly laughed at the man standing in front of the counter. Now their expressions carried a very different kind of curiosity. Karen drew a careful breath and lifted her eyes toward Daniel Whitmore. Sir, she said, her voice noticeably more measured now. I followed standard procedures based on the information presented to me. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down again at the torn check pieces and then back toward Marcus Bennett. Mr. Bennett, he said respectfully, did you inform the staff that you had already visited other banks today? Marcus nodded once. Yes, sir, he answered quietly. This was the fourth one. Daniel Whitmore studied him for a moment, and the assistant beside him quietly lowered the tablet, as if the information on the screen had already said everything necessary. And each of them refused the deposit? Daniel Whitmore asked. Marcus gave a small nod. They declined, he replied calmly. Daniel Whitmore exhaled softly through his nose, a thoughtful gesture more than frustration. The marble floor reflected the bright lobby lights beneath their feet, while the large gold letters on the wall seemed to watch over the scene in silent witness. Karen shifted her weight slightly behind the counter. Sir, when someone presents a document that appears inconsistent with their financial profile, we are required to evaluate the risk, she said carefully. Daniel Whitmore turned his gaze toward her again, his expression composed but firm. Karen, he said evenly, our responsibility is to verify information before we judge it. The statement was not loud, but the quiet weight behind it carried clearly across the lobby. Karen felt her throat tighten slightly as she glanced once more at the paper lying on the counter. 2 clean tears through a check that had already been proven legitimate. Marcus Bennett reached forward slowly and rested his fingertips near the edge of the torn halves. not picking them up yet, simply touching the paper as if acknowledging what had just happened. Daniel Whitmore followed the movement with calm attention. "Mr. Bennett," he said respectfully, "it appears this situation began with an unfortunate assumption." Marcus looked up and met the older man's gaze with the same steady calm he had shown from the beginning. For the first time since the conversation started, a faint, thoughtful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "It did." The quiet in the lobby lingered for several seconds after Marcus Bennett spoke. "Yes, sir. It did." The words were simple, yet they carried the calm weight of a man who had already accepted the moment long before anyone else understood it. Daniel Whitmore rested both hands lightly on the counter, his eyes moving once more from Marcus to the two torn pieces of the check lying neatly together on the polished wood surface. The bright overhead lights reflected faintly off the paper as though even the fragments were aware that they represented something larger than a financial transaction. Karen Whitmore felt the attention of the entire room pressing toward the counter. The tellers behind her terminals had stopped typing. The customers in line had forgotten their own transactions. Even the security officer who had just stepped into the lobby slowed his approach when he noticed Daniel Whitmore standing there. Karen finally drew in a quiet breath and spoke again, though her voice no longer carried the same certainty it had earlier. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "if the check is legitimate, we can certainly attempt to reconstruct the document and process the deposit." Marcus glanced down at the two halves of the paper and gently slid them closer together with his fingertips, aligning the torn edges so that the numbers once again formed a complete figure. $10 million. He studied the paper for a moment before looking up again. "That will not be necessary," he said calmly. The response caused several heads in the lobby to tilt with curiosity. Daniel Whitmore lifted his eyebrows slightly. "You no longer wish to deposit the funds here?" he asked. Marcus paused for a moment, considering the question with the same quiet patience he had shown all morning. Sunlight from the tall windows continued to stretch across the marble floor, and outside the city traffic moved in steady rhythm as though nothing unusual had occurred. Finally Marcus spoke again. "This morning I visited 4 banks," he said. "Not one of them asked where the check came from. Not one asked what the funds were for. They only decided whether I looked like someone who should be holding it." The words were not spoken with anger. They carried a calm honesty that seemed to travel through the room like a quiet current. Karen lowered her eyes briefly toward the counter. Daniel Whitmore remained still, listening. Marcus rested his hand lightly over the photograph inside his jacket pocket, as if confirming that it was still there. "The money comes from the sale of a small manufacturing company," he continued. "I spent 12 years building it with a group of employees who trusted me when the business was barely worth a pickup truck and a borrowed workshop." Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly, the story already aligning with the verification his assistant had just received. Marcus continued, his voice steady and thoughtful. "I plan to place the funds somewhere that understood long-term investment," he said. "Somewhere that respected patience and hard work." He looked briefly around the lobby before returning his gaze to the counter. The torn check remained perfectly aligned beneath the bright lights. "Today has been educational," he added quietly. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for a moment, studying the man across from him with renewed interest. The assistant beside him glanced again at the tablet screen, and then back toward Marcus Bennett, clearly aware that the situation unfolding in front of them carried more significance than a simple deposit. Finally, Daniel Whitmore spoke. Again, his tone calm but sincere. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I believe this bank may have given you the wrong first impression." Marcus considered the statement for a moment before answering. "First impressions," he said softly, "usually reveal more than people realize." The quiet in the lobby returned once again, deeper now, as everyone present understood that something more important than $10 million had just been placed on the counter. The quiet after Marcus Bennett's words settled across the lobby like a slow-moving tide. First impressions usually reveal more than people realize. No one spoke immediately after he said it. Even the faint sounds of the city outside seemed distant through the tall glass windows. Daniel Whitmore stood still at the counter, studying the man in front of him with a deeper focus now, the kind of attention reserved for someone whose story had just shifted the direction of a conversation. The torn check remained carefully aligned on the polished surface, the number $10 million visible again where Marcus had matched the edges together. Karen Whitmore kept her hands folded near the counter, though the confidence that had guided her earlier decisions had faded into something far more uncertain. She had spent 15 years working inside banks, learning how to evaluate risk, how to recognize patterns, how to make quick judgments about people standing on the other side of the counter. Yet at this moment those instincts felt strangely unreliable. Daniel Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I would like to understand something." Marcus lifted his eyes toward him with quiet patience. "Yes, sir." Daniel Whitmore gestured lightly toward the torn check. "If you no longer intend to deposit the funds here, why did you come in person instead of sending the transaction electronically through a financial advisor?" Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering. His gaze drifted briefly toward the sunlight stretching across the marble floor, then returned to the older man. "Because sometimes it is important to see how people respond before the numbers arrive," he said. The statement caused several quiet glances to pass between the customers waiting in line. Daniel Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the earlier tension in his eyes. "You expected resistance," he said. Marcus nodded slowly. "Not resistance," he replied. "Revelation." The word lingered in the quiet air of the lobby. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly, folding his hands in front of him as if the conversation had just become far more interesting than a routine banking matter. "And what exactly did today reveal?" he asked calmly. Marcus rested his fingertips on the counter beside the torn check again, his voice steady. "That success changes numbers faster than it changes perception," he said. Karen Whitmore lowered her gaze again, feeling the truth behind the sentence settle uncomfortably in the room. Marcus continued after a moment. "I built a company that now employs 84 people," he explained. "We manufacture specialized components for agricultural equipment across 4 states. The business started in a rented garage with a single welding table and a pickup truck that barely ran. But the people who worked with me believed in the idea before the profits arrived." Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly as the pieces of the story formed in his mind. The assistant beside him quietly tapped a few notes into the tablet while listening. Marcus's voice remained calm and thoughtful. "Last month, a larger manufacturer purchased the company," he continued. "The check you see there was part of that agreement." The lobby remained silent except for the quiet hum of the lights above them. Marcus looked once more at the 2 halves of the paper on the counter. "The money is important," he added. "But the lesson this morning may be worth more." Daniel Whitmore studied him carefully for several seconds before speaking again. "Mr. Bennett," he said with quiet respect, "most people in your position would be angry." Marcus gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Anger would not change the result," he replied. "But understanding might." The words hung in the air between them as the lobby waited to see what would happen next. The silence after Marcus Bennett spoke seemed to stretch across the entire lobby like a slow breath that no one was ready to release. Anger would not change the result, but understanding might. Daniel Whitmore watched the man in front of him carefully, the thoughtful calm in Marcus's voice carrying more weight than any raised argument ever could. The sunlight from the tall windows continued to spill across the marble floor, catching the faint edges of the torn check where the paper rested between them on the counter. $10 million divided into 2 uneven halves, yet still clearly one document. Daniel Whitmore finally reached forward and gently lifted both pieces again, studying them as though the torn line across the center represented something larger than a financial mistake. After a moment, he placed them carefully back down and turned his attention toward Karen Whitmore. She had remained still through the entire conversation, her professional posture holding steady even as the quiet pressure of the room settled around her. Yet the confidence in her earlier decision had slowly drained away, replaced by the uneasy awareness that her judgment had not only been wrong but had been made too quickly. Daniel Whitmore spoke calmly, though his voice carried a quiet authority that everyone in the room could hear. "Karen," he said, "banking is built on trust." Karen lifted her eyes toward him, saying nothing. Daniel Whitmore continued in the same measured tone. "Trust in numbers, trust in verification, and most importantly trust in fairness." He gestured lightly toward the counter where the check rested. "When we forget that final part, we stop being a financial institution and start becoming something else." The words were not harsh. yet they carried the unmistakable weight of a lesson that everyone in the lobby could understand. Karen finally spoke, her voice controlled but softer than before. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "I owe you an apology." Marcus Bennett looked at her calmly. She continued after a moment. "My decision was based on assumptions that should have been verified before I acted." The lobby remained silent while she spoke. Marcus listened without interrupting. Karen drew a slow breath. "If you would still allow it," she added, "I would like the opportunity to correct that mistake and process your transaction properly." Marcus glanced down once more at the torn check pieces resting together on the counter. For a few seconds he did not answer. Instead, he looked around the lobby, taking in the tellers behind the counter, the customers waiting quietly in line, and the large gold letters on the wall that reflected the name Whitmore National Bank. Finally, he turned his attention back toward Daniel Whitmore. "Sir," Marcus said calmly, "may I ask you a question?" Daniel Whitmore nodded. "Of course." Marcus rested his hands lightly on the counter. "How many people walk into this building every day hoping to be treated with the same respect they give in return?" Daniel Whitmore considered the question carefully before answering. "More than we probably realize," he said quietly. Marcus nodded once as if the response confirmed something he already believed. Then he reached forward and lifted the two halves of the check from the counter, holding them gently between his fingers. The paper bent slightly along the torn edge but remained readable, the numbers still clear beneath the bright lights. Marcus looked at Karen Whitmore again, his expression thoughtful but calm. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said softly. "Everyone deserves a second chance." The sentence rested quietly in the air of the lobby, simple and steady, yet it seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the room. For a moment no one spoke. The bright light from the tall windows reflected softly across the marble floor and the polished counter where Marcus Bennett still held the two torn halves of the check between his fingers. Daniel Whitmore watched him with thoughtful attention, as if measuring the meaning behind the calm patience the man had carried since the moment he walked into the building. Karen Whitmore remained still behind the counter, her earlier certainty replaced with a quiet humility that had not been there before. Marcus looked down at the torn paper once more, and then placed the two halves gently back onto the counter, aligning the edges again so that the number across the center was visible beneath the lights. $10 million. Daniel Whitmore reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small silver pen. Without hurry, he slid the pen across the counter toward Karen. "Tape the document carefully and process the deposit," he said calmly. Karen nodded once, her movements careful now as she stepped toward the counter drawer and retrieved a clear strip of document tape. She worked slowly, aligning the edges with precision before pressing the transparent strip across the tear so the paper held together again. The number across the center was once again complete. She then turned toward the terminal behind her desk and began entering the routing information with focused attention, her fingers moving across the keyboard with professional care. The quiet tapping of the keys was the only sound in the lobby for several seconds. Marcus stood calmly while she worked, his hands resting lightly on the counter. Daniel Whitmore remained beside him, watching the process with composed interest. Finally, Karen turned the screen slightly and nodded. "The funds are now being transferred into a verified account under your name," she said respectfully. Marcus gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The tension that had filled the room earlier had softened into something different now, something closer to reflection. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket once more and pulled out the small photograph he had looked at earlier. The image of the young girl sitting on the hood of the old pickup truck caught the light for a moment before he glanced at it with a faint smile. Daniel Whitmore noticed the photo and spoke quietly. "Your daughter?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "You built a company from a garage and sold it for $10 million, he said thoughtfully. "That is not a small achievement." Marcus slid the photograph carefully back into his pocket. "The achievement belongs to the people who worked beside me," he replied. "I only helped guide the idea." Karen finished confirming the transaction and printed a receipt, placing it gently on the counter. Marcus accepted it with a nod. For a moment he looked around the lobby once more, taking in the people, the polished marble floor, and the large gold letters on the wall. Then he turned back toward Karen Whitmore and Daniel Whitmore. His voice remained calm as he spoke one final time. "Money is powerful," he said quietly, "but respect is worth more." Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly in agreement. Marcus Bennett turned toward the glass doors and stepped into the sunlight outside, leaving the quiet lobby behind him as the reflection of Whitmore National Bank shimmered across the marble floor.